So hi everyone, Mr. Burke here, and I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about HBS 1.1.2, in which we learned about directional terms. I've created some slides and put them on my iPad, and I'm going to annotate on my iPad and explain those directional terms. But an introduction to this video is going to make sure that you understand that directional terms are oppositional pairs. So you memorize them in tandem. And if you memorize one, then you kind of memorize the other if you at least remember what its pair is. So if you learn the word for front and you know what front means, and then you learn the word back, even if you don't remember what back means, you know it's the opposite of front and you can figure it out. Now, obviously, we're going to use some more advanced language than front and back a little bit, but these terms are really important because throughout the year, I'll be giving you directions for your mannequins or for your digital models we'll be using. And just the study of anatomy and physiology requires you to understand and have a common vocabulary for us to discuss and describe where something is on the body. And directional terms are a great start. We'll also learn about anatomical landmarks, which help give us some more precision, but directional terms, which this video is about, is kind of your first introduction, which you need to understand. So you can use the timestamps in the video's description here on YouTube to jump around to the different oppositional pairs. And also you can check It's Learning and you'll find a PDF of the final version of all this in addition to this video. So make sure that you are taking notes versus what you've been studying and learning and using these definitions to help you do your retrieval practice so you can memorize these words and use them fluently in class.
So, anterior and posterior are words that we use to describe the front and back of the body. So, the posterior portion is towards the spine, it's the back half of the body. Your elementary school PE teacher probably told you to sit on your posterior when you were in the gym. And then the anterior is the portion of the body that I should be seeing on the Teams calls that we're on. It's the front half. It's what we generally present to the world. Anterior and posterior are oppositional directional terms. They mean the opposite of each other, but they are both dealing with this line that cuts the body into anterior and posterior portions. So this yellow dotted line is an imaginary plane that cuts our body into, again, a front half and a back half, also known as anterior and posterior. So inferior and superior are another set of oppositional pairs, but instead of talking about the front and the back, these two work in a transverse plane across the body, meaning they determine whether something is above or below. So these oppositional pairs determine for us or are used to explain if something is closer towards the head or closer towards the feet, the top half of the body or the bottom half of the body, or I should say the top extreme or the bottom extreme of the body. Now again, something can be superior even if it's the elbow, because we might say that the elbow is superior to the wrist. By using superior to describe these two different anatomical landmarks, we give ourselves orientation, even if the elbow is not all the way at the top of the skull. So the next set of oppositional pairs is medial and lateral. They both are dealing with the body in relation to the median plane, which is the plane that cuts the body down the middle into left and right hand sides. And the lateral term is telling us that something is further away from the midline. And the term medial And the term medial is telling us that something is closer to the midline. So this doesn't have to just apply to something on the being closer to the midline or further away, though. This can also apply to something as far away from the midline as your hand. You could say that, using our color codes up here, medial and lateral, you could say that the thumb is lateral to the pinky. So even though both of these structures are all the way on the arm, pretty much as far away as you could get away from the midline, we can still talk about these two things in relation to each other using the terms lateral and medial, because in anatomical position, the pinky is closer to the midline and the thumb is further away. So the thumb is lateral to the pinky. So distal and proximal are another set of oppositional pairs that are special terms because they only apply to the appendages, the things that project off of the torso. So distal and proximal are terms that describe something that is far away from the attachment point. In this case, the attachment point for the arm is going to be where the humeral head interacts with the scapula. And that is distal. So something that is farther away from what apparently I made as a hexagon. I was just trying to draw a circle, but and the term proximal is the opposite, and it means something that is closer to the attachment point. So looking at the elbow and the wrist, we could say that the elbow is proximal to the wrist, because the elbow is closer to the humerus than the wrist is. So you might be thinking that we're running out of ways in which we can orient the body, but superficial and deep is yet another one. So superficial and deep are terms that we will use a lot when we're building on our mannequins, and surgeons use a lot, but in your day-to-day circumstance, hopefully you're not using too often, because superficial and deep have to deal with how far something is into the body or how far away something is from the surface of the skin. So superficial means towards the surface of the skin. So superficial, I see the S here, and I think skin, so it's superficial. And then deep, being the opposite of that, just means deep inside the body. That one's pretty straightforward. And I have a picture here, and it's a little bit at a diagonal here so that you can see these different items that are in the digestive system. So this big meaty red thing is your liver, and then below your liver you have this little green sac thing that's sticking out called the gallbladder, and we can see it because the gallbladder comes out from underneath of the liver. But in our terms for superficial and deep, we would say that the gallbladder is deep to the liver. And we could go further and look at all the way down here. We can see a little bit of the pancreas, and the pancreas is even deeper. The pancreas is behind all of those things, so it is deep. And it's not just structures that are far inside of the body. We could use this term as well just to describe even the surface of the skin itself and the multiple layers of the skin. And we could say that the epidermis, the part that's on the outside, is the most superficial portion of your skin. And then we could say the dermis is below that, or it's deep to that. And then even below that, we have the hypodermis, which would be deep to the dermis. So superficial and deep allow us to move inside and outside of the body. So ventral and dorsal are our final set of oppositional pairs, and we're taking some time to distinguish this as separate from the anterior and posterior view that we looked at earlier, because Ventral and dorsal are essentially synonyms for anterior and posterior in humans. So the ventral portion and the dorsal portion of the body for humans are the same, because ventral means belly and dorsal means back. This matters and has a distinction because in anatomy and physiology, in your research and elsewhere, you might run into resources that use or reference quadrupeds or horizontally oriented animals. So these terms exist as a distinction because on a four-legged animal, ventral is going to mean the belly side here, and dorsal is going to mean the back side or the spine side, whereas we would use the terms anterior and posterior to help us identify how a animal has a front half and a back half differently than they would have a spine side and a belly side. So dorsal, if you think about a dorsal fin, on a shark or on a dolphin, right, we would have a dorsal fin on the back. That dorsal fin doesn't come out from down here, right? Dorsal doesn't mean down here. That's not where you would find a shark's fin. So we have this distinction between anterior, posterior, dorsal, and ventral, not for human anatomy and physiology, but instead for the difference in comparative anatomy between humans and quadrupeds or horizontally oriented animals. So for our purposes, when you're doing your research and you're finding the terms anterior, you can call anterior and ventral the same thing. And if you find posterior, you can call that dorsal. We will more often use the terms anterior and posterior, but don't be confused by finding those other terms in the research.